plot thickens. So I ended up just doing some lathe work there to rescue this bushing from that, broken mess. Because I decided I want to use it after all because, and I found a bolt that'll fit it good. The reason why I want to do that is because it turns out, you go back earlier in the IT manual that I took those photocopies from. If you look in the manual steering box parts breakdown, okay, the manual steering parts breakdown, they actually show right here, there's actually a call out that shows that there's a bolt with 2 flat washers that sandwich the dowel bushing, which is this thing, and a nut. And I was thinking, why do they have like regular bolts in several places and then all of a sudden they just have this weird deal down in that one location? And then it hit me. They want that to be a fixed point that's a pivot point. So that when you rock that cover on this pivot point, and you're going to control moving that cover on the pivot point by using that eccentric screw, you're going to change the mesh of the teeth on the lever shaft and the gear shaft. These 2 big shafts right here. Now, I may very well find that if I put this in there and I adjust the cover so that I get the take out the play, I may find that then the bolt holes for the other locations won't line up. That's why they basically tell you in the manual that if you're gonna do an overhaul that's gonna require that to happen because of wear or replacement of parts, that essentially you end up having to, they actually don't show a picture of it being done, but you have to use a hone and you have to elongate those holes essentially to compensate for this adjustment. So I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to go through that muckety-muck. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry fit this and check that, check for that end play and see how bad it is. And if it's not too bad, then I'm going to put my gasket and my RTV sealant in there and run with it that way. And then we'll go into the other adjustments, which again, that this is also was confusing. They're claiming that you've got several adjustments for the manual steering box, and then you should have one extra one, the rack, for the power steering, but something doesn't add up, and I'll cover that when we get to that. All right, so I've got that stud or the bolt with the sleeve in the bottom there. I've got that in, and I've got these bolts on here tightened up. I'm not tightening them all up because I'm just going to end up taking this apart and put the gasket in with the gasket material. But I just put it together now to this point so that I can check that mesh of those 2 gears. So those are the 2 sector gears on these 2 levers. So at the end of this shaft and at the end of this shaft. And the way that you check that is you put your pitman arms on and you hold this pitman arm, which is on the left side of the tractor. You hold this so it doesn't move, and while you're holding this so it doesn't move, you move this one back and forth. And there's a little bit of play in there. Doesn't seem like much, but it's in there. And actually, I'm looking at that, and some of that is actually the pitman arm. So I don't have these arms all the way on. Okay, there's a perceptible amount of play in there. Doesn't seem too bad, but there is some in there. So now I'm going to see whether or not if I can adjust this eccentric screw. I've got these bolts probably loose enough that I might be able to actually move this case a little bit. I want to see if I can actually change that adjustment. The theory being that the holes that these bolts are going through have a little bit of play in them, which will allow me to give a little bit of movement to this thing. Still a tiny bit there. Might have to loosen these bolts up just a little bit. just feel like it went away a little bit, went a little bit down. I don't know. I don't really see any perceptible difference there, so I don't think that this, I don't think I can actually make an adjustment here on that. And I think that what I've got there is such a minimal amount, I'm going to just leave it alone. Excuse me, I'm just going to leave it alone. While I have this open again, I just want to bring something to your attention in case you didn't realize it and you're working on one of these. This shaft right in here, this worm gear and the shaft with the steering wheel that goes on it, instead of being called the steering column, they actually call this the camshaft. And on the manual steering box, the end play of this shaft is adjusted by changing shims in the bottom here. On the power steering tractor, which is what this is, you do not deal with anything down here as far as the end play. The end play is controlled by how tight the thrust bearings are tightened down on, and that all happens up in this section here. You see these threads right here. There's going to be a nut when we put the cylinder on and all the thrust bearings and everything back together. There's going to be a nut we're going to tighten here that's going to control the end play. Oh, I was well on my way to getting this thing reassembled, and then I was putting the nut on this stud, and I thought, oh, the stud sticks out kind of far, so that's not great. Yeah, what's the big deal? And then I remembered, oh, that's right, the cylinder's going to go right here. The little hydraulic cylinder that actually works the power steering sits right here. I think that is going to hit, so I need to fix that. I guess I could just drive it out, have the long part on the back side there. It's tough to get the nuts to move down, because when you go to turn them, of course the whole thing wants to turn. That's why this one over here is actually not even fully seated. It's because, well, I can't tighten it unless I grab the stud, but then I run the risk of damaging the threads. As it is, I had trouble getting this one in. I was surprised that the threads didn't get damaged. But that nut's going on just fine. But now we got to take it out and tap it back out. See if it survives that. A couple of full-size bashes with this hammer on to make it come right out. Ah, just kidding. Brass. Now we're cooking. Anybody see where I put that lock washer and nut down? Oh boy, this nut that's underneath here is a heck of a one to get to. But as luck would have it, I have this crow's foot attachment for my 3/8 drive. And this extra long extension should do the trick. This hydraulic line's just a little bit in the way.
On?
Yeah.
Been checking online for appointments for vaccine.
Uh-huh.
I just found some on in Springfield at Eastfield Mall.
Yeah.
I should sign up for one?
But I can't sign up.
No, I don't think so.
So you want me to drive you out to Springfield, get you vaccinated, and then come home?
I don't know. Probably.
So if you get vaccinated, you're going to start going out to dinner with other people? Yeah.
As early as next week.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Alright. I don't know what time.
All right, so now I'm ready to do my next adjustment, which is the mesh between the lever shaft stud and the camshaft, which is on the lever shaft. There's that pin that rides in the worm gear on the camshaft, and the amount that pin's going to taper to it. So the further in that is pushed in, the more it can take up for wear in those parts. So that lever is pushed in by this adjusting screw right here. So I've backed off the jam nut and backed off that adjusting screw a little bit. The manual which is wrong, by the way, because the manual says that there, on the power steering unit, that there are 5 adjustments that can be made. That's not true. There's actually only 4. And the interesting thing is, on the manual box, there are 4 adjustments, but one of them is different. So on the manual box, you can adjust, using shims, you can adjust the end play of the camshaft, which you don't do that on the power steering box. But on the power steering box, you have the rack that meshes for the power steering piston. That is an adjustment that is not present on the manual box. So manual or power steering each have 4 adjustments, but one of the adjustments is different on depending on which box you have. So I'm going to do the lever stud. So for whatever reason, it says that before you adjust this, that you should back off the gear shaft, which is this shaft, end play adjustment, which is this one. It's a similar screw on the back here with a locking nut. That should be backed off 3 or 4 turns. So I did that. So now what it says to do is it says to put the steering at the midpoint. Obviously I have my pitman arms on wrong, but that's okay. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to adjust this so that at the midpoint you feel a slight drag. So I gotta find the end, which that's one end. So I'm gonna just put my pitman arm on this side facing up, and this one facing down, just so I can use them kind of like pointers to tell me where I am. And so then I'm going to go to the other extreme. So that's the other extreme. So we can see that that's roughly at like 2 o'clock, 2:30 or so. So right about here must be about the midpoint. So right in this area right here is the midpoint. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to turn this screw in until you can perceive a slight drag when going through the midpoint. Wow, that's just like locked up, so that's certainly not it. That's too much, I guess. That adjustment almost seems impossible to do with this moving up, and this is going to continue to move up until I put this steering valve back on and this nut back on. And they said that supposedly if I had this out on the bench I could make this adjustment, which makes me think that I shouldn't have to have this all on there, but I'm having too much difficulty. Alright, I decided I'm going to put together this assembly up here. That way I don't have to deal with that camshaft moving out when I'm trying to turn this through its limits. So I just got back from the store where I picked up new O-rings. I had some O-rings I had ordered under international part numbers a while back, but apparently I hadn't gotten all of them. I have this one. I'm missing one more that I couldn't get at the hardware store because of the size, so I might have to just put that top cover on temporarily. I also need a seal for that top cover anyways, but it's not going to stop me from putting this general stuff together here. So we've got this assembly right here. Okay, has an O-ring that goes in this groove and an O-ring that goes in this groove. I know this is the one that was on the bottom. There's another one that goes on the top right here. I don't know whether or not they're identical or not, so I'm going to keep them the way they were. So I already put the thrust washer in there, and then on top of the thrust washer goes this thrust bearing. It's a needle bearing. I can tell that this was the side facing that pretty clearly because you can see the staining from where this rusted. I cleaned this up though and it seems okay, so I'm going to reuse it. But I couldn't find any instructions on whether or not this should be packed with grease, but the more I look at it, the more I'm thinking that there isn't going to be, this whole point of this whole thing is pretty much to keep the fluid, I think, from getting past this point. Not sure, but it's my understanding of it. So I am going to pack this with grease. I know in the manual, the section of the manual that the section of the manual that talks about the manual steering gearbox, it talks about the upper one. There's only one of these, I think, in that setup, and it says to pack that with grease. I figure worst case scenario is that if I'm wrong about this and hydraulic fluid ends up going through that section, which I can't, because then it would dump right into the gearbox. So I think this should be greased. Then this sucker gets an O-ring in the outer groove, and I'll just get a little bit of lube on there. So this race side faces down to the bearing, which we already knew. I'm going to put just a little more grease on that. Then we get this small O-ring sits in this groove on the top here, and then we get this other O-ring in the outer groove. Now the steering valve goes on. Alright, so the steering valve has, right on the casting right here, there's markings PR and RT. So RT must be return. That needs to face up. Okay, so this is going to have to go on like this. This spool assembly has to go inside here, but you have to make sure you put this in the right way. This has a groove on the inside on one end that's not on the other end. The side with the groove has to face the end facing up with the PR and the RT. And actually they recommend, I believe they recommend putting some power steering fluid on this for some lube during assembly. It just kind of sits in there loose, huh? So that whole thing's going to end up being pulled up, actually, interestingly enough, when we tighten this up. I wouldn't have guessed that, but it is what it is. Alright, so PR and RT are facing up like they're supposed to. And I've got it oriented so that these are over on this side because the rigid lines come off of here and go to that cylinder. Oh, I've got this on wrong. These two lines here are supposed to be on this side. These are the lines that go out to the cylinder. So I'll just rotate this. Now on this steering valve, there are 6 of these little plungers. On some of these valves, there are other holes that have what they call inactive plungers, which are just solid plungers that don't move and have no springs between them. And that's discussed in the manual, but on mine those don't even exist. On mine you've got just three holes that the plungers go into, and each hole gets one plunger followed by the spring followed by a plunger. So the next part that gets installed is this part right here, which they're calling the race. This side right here faces up, whereas it faced down on the bottom. And that's going to be a pain. That keeps that O-ring in there. Well, I know what's going to keep it in there for me. A little dab of grease. I need that O-ring to stay put. Then I'm going to pack this bearing with grease. Then this thick washer here, Jack says the other race for that thrust bearing goes on. So, interestingly enough, I know I have these 3 parts left. I know this is the star locking washer that the tabs get bent up to keep this from loosening. Okay, but then I've got this keyed washer, which oddly enough is not showing up in the parts diagram, but I know it came out of here, so I know it's going to have to go on before the star washer for the star washer to be able to do its job. And this nut goes on. Now this nut gets tightened to a specific torque specification, and that's how you set this, I guess, the end play or the whatever. This nut's got chamfered edges on one side. I'm going to have that face up. All right, now, a couple of things. So before you tighten this down, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to center this race. See how this moves around? You need to center this. They actually say take a 6-inch scale or a pair of dividers and make sure that the distance from the edge of this race to, well, there's actually a nice big circle right here where the O-ring was. But I think it's actually to each one of these little plungers. Make sure that distance is equal before you tighten this down. Otherwise, when you go to put that upper tube assembly on, it can cause the steering wheel to bind, or the shaft to bind. So the funny thing is, the manual says that before you tighten this nut down, to make sure that the lever gear stud mesh, this thing we were adjusting over here, is properly adjusted, and the end play on this shaft here is properly adjusted. So go figure. But as we already discovered, it's kind of a pain in the butt to try and do this with this all apart. So now, just realizing now that if I turn this, it's going to want to do the same thing, push up on this, it's going to pop this off. So I really still can't do anything without that cover on and the bolts on. So I think I'm going to temporarily install those, and then after I get this set to where I want it set, this mesh adjustment, when I'm satisfied with those adjustments, I'll take this cover back off and I'll tighten this down. Which, by the way, this is supposed to be tightened to a certain torque specification, which I have no idea how the heck I'm going to do that, because I can't put a socket on there because of the length of the shaft here. So I'm sure there's a special wrench I could use, or an offset wrench, I guess, and then you got to do like a torque multiplier type of deal or something. So the funny thing is, I think that seal was in there upside down by design. We get a needle bearing right here, which I'm going to pack with grease, and the only thing that's going to lubricate that, I think, is going to be the grease that's going to be in there. So this is sitting like this, so grease isn't going to migrate up past that seal. In other words, that seal is in the top here, I think, to keep water from getting down into here. And you want the grooved side of the seal facing the liquid that you're trying to keep in or out in this case. So I think that seal might have been correctly installed upside down. Alright, so I coated that O-ring on that outer race with power steering fluid to help it pop into its position without getting pinched, even though this is just temporary because I don't even have the O-ring in there. That's the one O-ring I still need to source. And at least now with this bolted on, I should be able to throw the steering wheel on here, run it back and forth and see how it feels. Get a better idea for that drag that they were talking about. So that's one limit right there. That's the other limit there. So I mean, that feels, that something is not right here. What the heck is going on with this thing? I've got this all put together, and look what happens when I back up. This is coming out. That's not being held in. How is that happening? Oh man. All right, just took a minute to think about it. Looked at the parts diagram, and it's occurring to me the only way that this could be happening, that when I turn this like this, that this is still going up like that, is if that nut is lifting up off of this assembly. So even though I thought I had that nut tight, I think I had it tight, but I think you have to back this camshaft out and then tighten the nut, And then this space will be left here, but I think that might be normal because I don't have the steering wheel fully seated on the taper, and this is an aftermarket steering wheel. It's a completely different wheel. So that might be what's going on there. So I've got to take this cover off again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that up like that with that space in there. Ow! Oh, that was sharp. Pinched my finger between. Oh. All right. If I'm right, when I pull this cover off, I should see a big space underneath that nut. Well, hell yeah. Okay. Not only that, but that completely loosened up. And when that loosened up, that allowed, as soon as I took that tube off, that allowed this to move around. So I got to reset my settings here. All right. I'm not going to put all the bolts in. We'll test my theory. Oh, look at that. But wait a minute now. Did it just do that because it just unscrewed again? I think it is. I think it's unscrewing. I think that locking washer has to be on there. Pull this cover again, and if that nut is loose again, then I'll know that's what's happening. And I could stop freaking out. That seems tight. Hey everybody, so yesterday evening I was working on this pretty late, and I was getting pretty disgusted because it seems like no matter how I adjust that adjustment, I can't seem to get this bind to come out of the steering. And I'm pretty sure I know what's going on. I think what's happening is that the mesh between those two gears changes as the lever shaft and the gear shaft rotate, because one or both of those shafts has a bend in it. Seems to me I recall way back when I was working on this thing, that when I had these shafts out and everything, that I was able to determine that one, if not both of them, had a slight bow to them, which is probably caused by, more than likely what had happened was when that bearing failed and all those metal pieces were in there, they literally were getting caught between the teeth, and the teeth were actually crushing, and that force was able to damage these shafts. And the problem is that these shafts, just like any of the internal parts in this steering gearbox, are non-existent. They're all obsolete, and no boneyard's going to want to open up a box and sell you the parts inside. They're only going to sell you the complete box, and we already discussed that. Again, going rate for, I guess one sold on eBay a few months back for around $750. That's probably the cheapest that I've seen one go for a while. And I think that might have been a manual one. I don't even think that was a power steering one. So I've decided to step back, regroup, and rethink my position on this. I'm not in a position where I want to put that kind of money into a used gearbox that's going to be questionable. So I'm going to push forward with this as best as I can, which means I'm going to get a lot less finicky. So last night what I did off camera is I finished messing with these adjustments to the max that I wanted to do, the gear shaft end play and the lever shaft stud mesh. And then I also went back in here, I tightened down that nut. I just took a stab at guessing what was tight enough so that it's not crushing those thrust bearings, but still basically creating a situation where there isn't a ton of play in the steering, in the camshaft. All right, so that's where we stand now. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to work on putting this rack gear assembly in and the piston. I noticed that this is very noisy at times. It's not too bad today, but it started to get noisy, and what I think's going on there is that I've only got a light coating of power steering fluid on those metal-to-metal parts. So I really don't want to be turning this a whole lot if I can avoid it until I actually get fluid pumping in there. So, and I can't do that until I have these lines hooked up to the piston, and I can't do that until the piston's on the steering box. So I got to get the rack in there, and we'll do that. And then we'll hook up some lines, and we'll see where we are.